Amen. So, I mentioned being at Lambeth Palace earlier. Well, actually, I just need to just change the view. I was asked to go in a pastoral capacity for someone. It's in a kind of complex situation, but we were talking at the end, and he said, even if the gospel wasn't true, he said, there's no other story that changes people like it, is there? And I thought, it is a very profound statement. It can sound almost like a lacking in faith statement, even if the gospel wasn't true. But actually, there is something that I think is marvelous about it. It's kind of almost the paradox of the fact that even if it wasn't true, you have to explain how come it works so well. And you say, well, and if you asked any one person around the room, or any two people, should say, or more, and said, what is the gospel? We would probably say it in different ways. So somehow the story even varies as you are, depending on the person you ask. But the point is, it is the story of Jesus. And some people will do it in a quick instance. Jesus is the Son of God who leaves eternity, dies for us on sins on the cross, and he wants to come into a relationship with you, and we can do it in 30 seconds, And other people, probably people like myself, will want to kind of do a longer story. The remarkable things that we can say, and he comes as a man in history. He's not an abstract idea, because that's the thing. We can all be perfect if we're just floating in some sort of abstract space. When I'm just waking up in the morning, I'm the most perfect human being there is, When I have to open the door for my dog, I start getting grumpy, and now don't get me on having to turn up for church by 10:30 when the kids are playing up, You can be perfect very easily if there's no context. But Jesus comes so the history is not unimportant. That the history is part of what makes the story so transformational. There's that wonderful, if anyone's read any of the kind of the spiritual story of the team working on the bridge over the River Kwai, building the thing. There's a kind of a moment in there where someone is challenging one of those who's come to that experience of Jesus as to what's Jesus got to say to me in this situation. What's he got to say? And as he's taken through the gospel, he discovers and feels it of not a God who is abstract, or a person who came up with lofty ideas. And being a little blunt, because I have to be careful with putting that on YouTube, but there are plenty enough spiritual leaders who in their ivory towers have come up with wonderful statements, but that's very, very different from actually demonstrating and living something, isn't it? With all of the messiness, and if you disconnect Jesus from the story, I feel he loses the power, because the story somehow does it. And as we think about this week, as the baby comes, as the baby lies there, he's not Superman baby, and if one of those shepherds was a particularly angry person and wanted to whack him with his staff, he would bruise and bleed, You can hurt. In other words, the revelation is something about us matters to God enough that we can hurt him, if I can put it those ways. And that's all part of the history. There's not a theological line that we find in the Bible that says, by the way, humans can hurt God. That's the implications of the story of a God who makes himself vulnerable for the sake of relationship. Does that make sense? So I've got a bit of time because I know we've got less slides, and so I'm talking about the things I enjoy talking about. That if you're a theologian, you come up with words like God is omnipresent. That means he's everywhere. And I always think, and he's omniscient, so he knows everything, and he's omnipotent because he's all powerful. But I always used to like to qualify those, and I still do. So that God is omnipotent, he has got all power, but for the sake of relationship, there are times he has all authority, but for the sake of relationship, he chooses not to have all control. He is omniscient, but for the sake of relationship, sometimes he chooses not to look. And I sometimes Christmas is a good time to explain that, actually, because when you're growing up, not what you're growing up, when my kids were growing up, you give them the pocket money that they're going to buy you Christmas presents with. And not only do you give them the pocket money you're going to buy Christmas presents with, but you have to take them to the shops to buy your Christmas presents. And so you have a choice. I could know, but sometimes you choose not to look for the sake of relationship. Does that make sense? And there are times where, and that's the revelation of the story we have of God who is omniscient, but for the sake of relationship is choosing not to look until we invite him in, till we look to show him. He has all authority, he is all powerful, but for the sake of relationship, he leaves things in our control for us to deal with and make a mess with even. And that's part of the wonderful thing. And similarly, you know, even if I can put it this way, and I don't want to kind of get too heavy in this evening, but actually understanding hell is the God who is omnipresent, who is everywhere, has actually created a space for those that don't want him. He's actually chosen, for the sake of relationship and your choices, to make a space where he isn't, if you can think of it like that. It's a wonderful sort of a thing, isn't it? Sorry. And I find so much of that only makes sense if we allow the story of Jesus rather than just God, if I can put it that way. Jesus, who is God, revealing everything that can be said about God into humanity, everything we can get our heads around. So there are things by God's very nature that I am just not smart enough to understand. There are sometimes slightly kind of proud Christians who like to think that they've got it all sewn up. But actually that makes God small. If your head is big enough to really fully understand him, then he's not that big, if I can put it that way. So there have to be things about God that they're impossible for me to know. But everything that humanity can know, somehow he is packed into Jesus. And in the way he works and the way he walks and the things he does and the things he says, I can look at it and go, I get that. I understand that. I understand it's proper to be angry with sin, because sin normally costs someone somewhere down the line. It would be wrong not to be angry, but somehow that truth is held in tension with grace, and actually somehow he gets it right. He navigates it. He knows where forgiveness needs to come. With the level, you know, it's neither do I condemn you, but go and sin no more. Balances the two, and the two are kind of held in this wonderful dynamic tension that you only get in doing life. You can't put it on a theological crib sheet, if you know what I mean. That's why. Sorry, this is totally. I'm now preaching, aren't I? I was going to say that's why, you know, you get situations like in the First World War, where two very sincere believers, one will feel led by the Spirit to go to the front line, and the other will feel led by the Spirit to become a conscientious objector. And actually, you see, because the thing is that there is a genuine tension. You know, there is a right motive for saying I will not shoot that man, and there is a wrong motive, which is actually I don't want to stand up for what's true and what, you know, and so and which one do you choose? In the end, it's the balance and what's going on in your heart and how am I dealing with you. So there's no contradiction in the idea that in complex situations like that, God might say one thing to one person and another to another, and they both heard the Lord in their context, because that's the reality of life in tension, and Jesus somehow does it. So anyway, that's my kicking off point. So what are we doing tonight?
Speaker flashing is muted on the screen.
Yes, it's muted on the screen, because if I turn it on, it's not on. It will be. This will be recording.
Yeah.
I hope. Otherwise, what happens is you'll get an echo, because it comes out there about a second afterwards.
Yeah.
So
it was just a bit unnerving having it just flashing in the background, and I just thought, what?
Yeah. So we'll find out. Otherwise, I'll be re-recording a dub session on this. So with session 3, we're going to look at the shepherds, family, and new friends. I've called it. It's the arrival of Jesus, because as next week we're going to look at the star and the magi, but they come a fair bit later. There's quite a big gap, and you'll see. But so we're looking at the kind of the actual moments of the arrival of Jesus and the social context and the historical context that he comes into. So what have I just done? I need to come. I have got. It says stop recording, which actually means it should be recording.
Oh, right.
So yeah.
So you did say to
I did say to remind me, and it is recording. So where we left the situation last time is Joseph went to be registered with Mary, who was promised in marriage to him, and who was expecting a child. So there's an 85-mile journey, which offers Mary some protection from gossip and assumptions, as we said. There's Nazareth up there at the top, as you can see it. and down there in Judea and Bethany. You'd think, wouldn't you, that the direct route is straight through Samaria, but the kind of the better serviced route, if I can put it, actually runs along the Jordan. So it takes longer because it's more days, but it's a kind of a safer route and so on. The other one is a bit more cross country, and there's some antagonism with the Samaritans. So we don't know which way Joseph's gone, but it is 85 miles roughly as the crow flies. So it's putting a bit of distance and space. Yeah, it's about on a donkey. It's going to be 3 or 4 days, isn't it? That 20 miles a day sounds like a lot on a donkey when you're pregnant. Now, but that actually, so maybe not. Maybe it takes longer then. Maybe it does take longer. But actually, that throws it in an issue because actually, as we look at the kind of the text. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. That little while, to me, and it's often you play with these single words, it implies it doesn't the kind of often the nativity picture of they just arrive and then she goes into labour. It actually gives you a much more protracted kind of sense, if you like. And there's a wonderful kind of romance in the kind of instant arrival, and it's all a rushed situation. But actually, we're going to see, and some of that is because of assumptions around words and so on. I think that the while implies that probably there is a kind of an element in which some of this is we've got to go anyway. We've got to go down and register. Let's while people know that you're not yet really married and you're pregnant, it probably is sensible just to kind of visually remove ourselves from our community, and by the time we come back, nobody will really be they'll have lost track of the time and so on. It makes only those who are close would then know, wouldn't they? So I suspect that actually the journey isn't at the moment where Mary is absolutely about to give birth, but they use the opportunity, they use the logic, and as we say, the census is a registration that is a kind of a rolling process. It won't all happen in one day. Can you imagine the queues? And they head down. It may well be, and because we're not given this, because actually we'll see next week, the earliest date for Christmas. The earliest date that recorded by the early church fathers is not December the 25th. It's a date actually in April, which actually ties in with some of the astrological movements that we read about in the story of the Magi. So if Jesus is actually born probably late April, which is after Passover, actually what it would mean is that there's a nice opportunity for Joseph and Mary to have actually travelled down as part of of a Passover pilgrimage party. Does that make sense? So they wouldn't necessarily have to travel down totally all on their own and unprotected. They would travel down with family towards Jerusalem, and then they would just stay in that region. They would stay in that area. Does that make sense? But then we kind of get that thing, and she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no space for them at the lodgings. I put the words lodgings. And again, we have that kind of we have that wonderful kind of Christmas nativity experience where we have the innkeeper knocking at the door. We have no room, you can go and stay in. But actually it doesn't say that. It just actually says there's no space in the lodgings. So the Greek word that's used there is katalumia, or kataluma, not lumia, kataluma. It's a very loose word. It literally kind of means a break place, a place to take a. So if you're on a journey, it's a place where you can take a break. But it's actually used quite generally, and actually we find it again in Matthew 14, where it's actually the name for the room that the Last Supper is eaten in. And so the Last Supper room is not an inn, if I can put it that way. It's just that it's one of those quirks of history that the translators of the King James decided to go with the word inn. Which it can mean, but normally it doesn't, if I can put it that way. The thing that's quite interesting, I've got the Strong's definition for it, in case people don't believe me. It actually describes it as a local travel lodge. So less of an inn, more of a travel lodge. That's the logic, i.e. it's somewhere that if you're taking a journey, you take a break in. But most of the time in the ancient world, you stayed with families and with people. And the Romans do have inns, And one of the criticisms that's often been made of the Christmas narrative is that there's no archaeological evidence for an inn in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem at the time is not a big town. If you remember when I say it's not a big town, do you remember that we thought a couple of weeks ago when looking at the census? That was only a week ago, wasn't it? We were looking at the census, and there was that quote, I'm just trying to remember which of the early church fathers it was, referring to the records that were there in the Temple of Peace in Rome, and said, and it confirms that Bethlehem was there, i.e. it was occupied, because it is only a small town. And what he's saying is, you may not have heard of it because you're in Rome, and it's a tiny, it's like, well, it'd be a bit like Cookham, really, wouldn't it? If you go halfway around the world and people say, where do you come from? What do you say? Do you say Cookham, or do you say London, or do you say Maidenhead? I say all three, depending on whether I think they'll know it or not. You know, and Bethlehem is a tiny little place, and so actually archaeologically, as far as they're concerned, as far as the archaeology of the place is concerned, there's no evidence of a Roman inn. So, but the Greek doesn't have to be, and actually makes more sense, because you can imagine a situation now where there's a family registration and it's in Bethlehem. Now, as we thought last week, it may be that not everybody had to go to the town they were born in. They could have just gone to their hometown. That's what the wording was. But Joseph goes to Bethlehem. It says because he was of the house of David. And we thought last time there's a possibility, which I quite like, but I see it as a possibility, that Herod has deliberately wanted to gather those who are part of the Davidic family. So everyone's kind of just normally, most of them are just going to their hometown. So I work in Nazareth, so I go and register in Nazareth. They've got all my local tax records. They've got all of those things. I can go and register tax records from a Jewish point of view, now becoming Roman. But because Joseph is part of the line of David, he has to go down and register in Bethlehem. And if we've had the Passover, so 2 million, something like estimated, I think, was it 200,000? It's only a matter of a few noughts, isn't it? I can't remember. Just Joseph is reckoning on, I think it's either 2 million or 200,000. A factor of 10 out. It's quite a big thing, really. But there's a huge crowd of people who are coming down to the feasts. And actually, as we can see, timing-wise, we'll look at this next week. If there's this kind of run-up where it makes sense for Joseph and Mary to travel down with a pilgrimage party, going down to the feast, and of course there's 40 days then through till to Pentecost. So 40 days, sorry, it's 50 days to Pentecost. 40 days that Jesus was appearing to people. 50 days to Pentecost. Quite a lot of people don't leave Jerusalem during that period. In fact, if you did last year when we were working through the different parts of the gospel, there is a period where Jesus seems to be down around Jerusalem for the whole of the period from Passover to Pentecost. And it's one of those nice little moments, because I call these things, they're unintended kind of verifications of the historical accuracy of the Gospels. They don't tell us in the Gospels very much that Jesus stays there the whole time, but if you look at the locations of the event, they're all down in the south. And we have things, for instance, like John communicating backwards and forwards with Jesus. You can't do that for Jesus in Galilee. It would take about 7 days to get from Machaerus, where John is being held, but it's only a day's journey to Jerusalem, for instance. And there are all these there are all sorts of little incidents where you can say, oh, that seems to be down the south. When you put them all together, it looks like Jesus has gone down for Passover and he stays to Pentecost. Those Pentecost is not mentioned, Passover is, but that makes sense if you saw them. So if they've come down, and it really is, and we'll look at the dating next week in much more detail. Come down with the Passover group, or probably anonymously with them. That's going to put pressure on places to lodge, and then people are staying on in the area. That puts pressure on places to lodge, and there is a registration going on, so people are having to come to Bethlehem. And so the kind of the concept much more is that this is actually this is from Harvard. This picture. There's a museum in Harvard, and this photograph is of a first century Jewish home. And it's a home with a guest room, with a lodging space. So it's 2 stories, because not every house would have 2 stories, which is why the upper room that they use for the Last Supper is a catalumia. It's a lodging space. And so in the upper room is where people often stay. Down below, during the winter time, the animals come in and live there. So there's space for the animals to live in the lower quarters, and there's regularly a kind of a built-in manger. So the actual narrative, kind of, if you're kind of putting it together, trying to get the feel of the history, is probably much more that if you're looking for kind of nice accommodation, it's probably pressurized, but somebody has very kindly said it's okay, we have got some space, but perhaps here with the animals. Now, it may be that my picture is not correct. So I do want to say I'm not pushing this as a strong, this is how it was. There is that cave that was recognized very early on in the kind of Christian church as an outside space and so on. And it may even be that is the case, that it's not even the room in the house. It literally is a kind of a cave for where animals are kept. When I say that cave, it's now got a church built over it, and the Church of the Nativity was once a cave and so on. So it's possible that church is the correct thing. Because all I'm saying really is this idea of the catalumia, the travel lodge. It's not a travel lodge. It's not a Roman inn. That's what those other pictures are. So not a Roman inn, not a travel lodge. It's that the kind of spaces where you'd normally expect to go are not available. So you'll have to look for kind of slightly better, slightly wider at the spaces. And in which case, if it is April time and it is around Passover, it is lambing season, so the sheep will be out. Okay. It's not freezing cold, it's not the deep midwinter. In which case, the space that they normally occupy is empty. Does that make sense? And so you can kind of see, just again, it's a bit speculative, but in terms of the kind of the social context of them as a family, and the way in which kind of Jewish hospitality and other things work, where we want to accommodate, but it's a bit tricky because everybody is down here. It's Passover season. It's coming up to or we've had Passover. We're coming up to Pentecost. We're trying to register people. They keep passing through. But we can accommodate you somewhere, but it's perhaps an area that otherwise would be occupied by animals. But at the moment it is springtime and they are out in the fields. So they were nearby, living out in the field, keeping guard over their flock at night. Shepherds, I should have said shepherds at the beginning. There were shepherds nearby. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were absolutely terrified. I put there, why did the angel visit the shepherd? It's a kind of rather obvious question, isn't it? What's going on with the shepherds? Because I'm sure Luke is writing. He's writing for a Gentile audience, but he himself is Jewish. It's one of the things we established last year. But why bother with this story? Now, it's often said that shepherds were the kind of the lowest of the low and so on. It's actually one of those urban myths. It's one that would be nice because it makes a good story. But the issue of things like their testimony not being valid in court, those came much later. They come from about 400 or 500 years later, rabbinic writings around that time. There is no evidence in anything that's been read from contemporary period with Jesus that shepherds were deemed stupid or whatever. So, and in actual fact, in Jewish culture, God presents himself as a shepherd. David, their greatest hero, was a shepherd. So there is a kind of a sense in which it would be quite an odd thing for a proper kind of Jewish community to downgrade in that kind of a context. But still there is the question as to why. And I think actually the answer is not the issue which is sometimes presented, is they were such bad witnesses that everyone would laugh at them and therefore they were bad witnesses. It's much more the sense of that actually there is something kind of going on which is much more within the heartbeat of God, who's always presented himself as the shepherd. I haven't. You see, this is the problem when I rush these things out. You see, and if I was doing this now as I'm talking to you, I would do a slide that would actually look at the word, the actual Hebrew pictograms that make the name El, God. Okay. The Hebrew pictograms, so the Hebrew letters, if you go way back, the Hebrew pictograms often refer to it as a bull with horns. But what's interesting is it's probably more generically in Hebrew thinking a livestock animal, not necessarily a bull. It's just a livestock animal. The reason I always refer to the Aleph as being a bull is because in the other languages around that use the same pictogram, they always call it a bull. But actually, the word for a ram is almost Aleph as well. It's Aleph, I think. It's a kind of a slight variation. And so God's name is spelt with a ram's head or a livestock head, and the L was a shepherd's crook. So the name God, in one sense, was kind of actually looks like a shepherd. Does that make sense? In that you've got a shepherd's crook, which is what the L sounds come from, the Lamech, and you've got a livestock animal, which traditionally, as Westerners we now refer, or not Westerners, as modern people who have archaeologically dug them up, we refer to it as a bull. But actually, the word seems to be any kind of livestock animal. So you kind of got this that sort of interesting little tie-in, if you see what I mean, of God as the shepherd, David as the shepherd. And there is a fascinating, and I hope you don't mind me going off on tangents, but I haven't got slides here. But it's partly because I know we've only got a few slides, so I feel free to go off on tangents. But the Jewish tradition tells us, that actually David is illegitimate. I don't know if people are aware of that. And the evidence is all circumstantial, but it does fit in Scripture. So, for instance, Samuel turns up and says to the elders, and he calls the elders of the town and Jesse, says, "Bring all your sons to a meal." And Jesse leaves David out in the field. And he says, "Is this all of them? Where's the other?" There's a point where David is referred to as the seventh son, and another point where he's referred to as the eighth son. So and there's a question of how come he's the seventh and an eighth? The way you get those kind of changes in order would be something like there is a younger who's legitimate and he's the illegitimate one. Does that make sense? So in terms of he's the seventh born, but he's the eighth in rank is the kind of the logic. And so there is a tradition within Judaism. And then of course you read his Psalms and he talks about how the elders talk about him and he's the laughing stock. And then he talks about how I was conceived in sin. And in kind of more modern kind of Protestant theology, we've turned that phrase "I was conceived into sin" as being a kind of an ancient Hebrew endorsement of the kind of Reformation doctrine of original sin, if you see what I mean. But actually, you don't find that doctrine in Judaism. So in Judaism, that's not what they read when they saw Paul, when they saw David saying, "I was conceived in sin." They read it much more kind of on the surface. Does that make sense? So why was I saying all of that? But David, of course, then comes out and I've gone for a total tangent, which doesn't actually help the point as to why does the angel go to the shepherds. We are going to see it on the slides. I was really going into David, of course, who is a shepherd. But his status is a little bit ignoble sometimes. It's not as and he kind of rises through. And actually, the rabbinic teaching was that part of his ability to they don't use the word empathy because it's a modern word, but his ability to empathize and draw people was his ability to identify with being an outcast, and that's how come he was able in the cave of Adullam to draw all those who were dispossessed and who were bitter and hurt, because he himself, in his relationship with the Lord, has kind of gone through the healing process. Whereas they tell us, you see, that Saul, who had the nice upbringing, was actually a much better, this is rabbinic writing, they say he's a much better king, he's a much better person, but that was his failure because he didn't actually understand how to take, lift up and so on. So that's a little bit of an aside just on the character of David. Let's come back to this question, because I've got a little thing down here. It says, this is Micah 4. And Micah, of course, some of you will recognise straight away, kind of prophetic of Jesus' birth. You've got passages there. It says, and you, O Tower of the Flock. And that little phrase, Tower of the Flock, is Migdal Eder, the hill of daughter of Zion. To you it shall come, the former dominion shall come, the sovereignty of the daughter of Jerusalem. That's Micah 4:8. And that little phrase, the Migdal Eder, which means the tower of the flock. Actually, all across the ancient world, people built agricultural towers, if I can put it that way. And this is actually one from Samaria. It's a photo taken about 1930. I went online and looked for various pictures of these things. But actually, the archaeologists have found these things that go all the way back to about 4, 5, 6, and even later, 1,000 years BC. And Bethlehem is a great pastoral area. So the region around Bethlehem is we find every period has had a little tower of the flock. I can put it that way. It is for watching your flocks at night. Or if you build it in a vineyard. Do you remember it talks about, there's the parable how God goes out and he plants a vineyard and he builds a wall and he puts up a tower. The tower is one like this. It's an agricultural one. It's about safeguarding your property or safeguarding your sheep. It's giving you an area that you can actually sit in a slightly elevated place so you can see further, you can have a fire on the top and so on. And so we have that prophecy, that reference to the Migdal Eder, and this is kind of roughly the sort of thing it would look like. And it is where shepherds go. So Micah, let's go back to that one. There we go. Micah has a kind of prophecy for the tower of the flock, the hill of the daughter of Zion. It shall come that the former dominion shall come, i.e. God's returning. God is coming to do something. The sovereignty of the daughter of Jerusalem. There's kind of something about God's leadership and God's authority that's tied in with the Migdal Eder. And we actually find that the one around Bethlehem is referred to in Genesis. So Rachel died. And so Jacob is travelling with them, if you remember. Rachel died and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So as they're approaching, they're coming from the north, I think, at this point. As they're approaching Bethlehem, they come into the region just outside, which is Ephrath. But the two kind of blend into each other. And Jacob set up a pillar at her grave, and that's the pillar of Rachel's tomb. And then Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower, the tower of Eder, or the Migdal Eder. So in other words, here comes Jacob, and Rachel dies just outside Bethlehem, but he sets up a little pillar to mark her spot, but then he travels on further. Does that make sense? And so what we know from that is it implies that Rachel died on the Jerusalem side of Bethlehem, because they haven't yet got to Bethlehem and the route they're coming. And that therefore the Migdal Eder is either just beyond that or just the other side of Bethlehem. But either way, Ephrathah is within, if you like, the radius. If you drew a line from Jerusalem to the tower, where the tower is, they will run for hundreds or even longer, because you build the tower on a slightly raised point. So it's not likely to move hugely. It's always going to be in the same sort of vicinity. If you drew a line from that and drew a circle then from Jerusalem that was out to the Migdal Eder, it would encompass and it would take in Bethlehem. So now why am I going into all that from a kind of rather boring semantic point of view? Because actually there's some interesting things that we find in the rabbinic writings. So the Targum of Jonathan, Jonathan actually, he's a well-known rabbi. You might have heard of the Targum of Jonathan, or the Babylonian Talmuds and so on. But Jonathan, there's also I think he was involved in those. The Targum of Jonathan, he was a disciple of Hillel, the generation after a guy called Hillel. And the generation that came after him, he was contemporary he almost was contemporary with the first Gamaliel, who of course we encounter in the Bible. So he's the generation before Jesus. And although the Targum isn't written down until about 500, his words are supposedly written from before Jesus, just before Jesus. So he lives in that generation immediately before. And he had this comment on the passage in Genesis. He said, "And Jacob proceeded and spread his tent beyond the tower of Eder, and the place from whence it is to be." So was the place, in other words, the tower of Eder, where the place from whence it is to be that the king, the Messiah, will be revealed at the end of days. Okay, that's interesting. If you stop and think about it, because I don't fully understand where he got it from, but as he has read Scripture, and he has put things together in discussion. He has come to the conclusion in the generation before Jesus that the Tower of Eda, the watchtower of the flock, the place where shepherds watch their flocks from at night, just outside Bethlehem, is the place where the Messiah is going to be revealed from. That makes sense? Not born, revealed from. Okay, because everybody knows where the Messiah is going to be born. He's going to be born in Bethlehem, but the revelation is going to start from the tower just outside Bethlehem. So I don't think I've been very clear in the way, but you got the kind of the feel of it. And it's interesting because I can't show you an instant Old Testament verse, but what we do know is that the best rabbinic teacher of his generation, or one of the best, just before Jesus comes, is saying that that's where we should expect the revelation to start from the tower just outside Bethlehem that the shepherds sit in to watch their flocks from at night. Does that make sense? So the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem, but he's to be revealed from just outside. Now, there's something else that's interesting, because now we begin to understand, okay, so the angels turning up, this is the beginning of the revelation. They're probably turning up while the shepherds are sitting there in their little tower. And in the one I showed you has the foliage top. But actually, during the summer and as the weather is improving and so on, all those sort of things, often the top is taken down. You actually can have a fire on top of the thing, if you sort of mean. That's the way it works. So you can imagine them all sitting around, as I say, genuinely watching their flocks by night, all seated on the ground. Well, it's not quite on the ground; they're about 6 foot up, but it's not a really big tower. It's just enough to give them a little bit of elevation. So maybe we should change the words of that carol, shouldn't we? So I'm trying to see if I can do that. Shepherds watch their flocks by night, all seated 6 foot off the ground. that would definitely make them sound angelic, wouldn't it, if they were doing that? But this is from the Mishnah now. So there are various kind of Hebrew writings. There's the Talmuds, the Targums. The Targums are kind of they were popular explanations of the Bible, if I can put it that way. That as the Jews had gone out, so the passage we just saw previously was a popular explanation of the Bible. So he takes a passage and then he explains it a bit more and draws stuff in. So it's like we do in church today. If I'm going to explain this passage, I'll pull in this and I'll pull in that and I'll show it to you. So that's what the Targums are. The Mishnah is the writings of various rabbis on more general things and making decisions as to how the community should work and so on. In the Mishnah, Bava Kama 7.7, they always have kind of words and things that I haven't a clue what they mean, but I just recite them as if I'm knowledgeable. It says it's forbidden to raise a small herd of animals, i.e. sheep, goats, etc., in the land of Israel. Now that doesn't make sense to us because we know that Israelites are always raising animals, but you'll see what it means. But it is permitted to rear them in Syria or in the wildernesses of the land of Israel. And basically what scholars will tell you this means is what it's saying is you're not allowed to raise your flocks just outside major towns and cities. You have to go a bit further afield. Does that make sense? So that's the general rule, i.e. no sheep immediately around towns and cities, except, as we go on, the one difference is what we discovered is that actually the one exception is around Jerusalem. Which includes Bethlehem, the Bethlehem shepherds. So cattle found all the way from Jerusalem to, there it is again, it's the Migdal Eder, it's the tower of the flock, it's the flock that the shepherds sit on, all the way to that tower, in that same vicinity in all directions, which is why I was explaining how it seems a bit further than Bethlehem. So you go out to there, just a bit further than Bethlehem, in all directions are considered, if male, as whole offerings, and if female, as peace offerings. In other words, the temple draws its sheep for sacrifice from a flock that has special status to be allowed to be grazed close to a proper kind of conurbation, because obviously the temple needs them, doesn't it? So it has a special dispensation. But that dispensation is actually in a big circle and it goes out to the Migdal Eder, which means that the shepherds are out there watching flocks that are going to produce sheep for sacrifice in the temple, which suddenly is starting to make it all feel a bit, okay. do you kind of, you get the feeling? So that's Rabbi Yehuda says, if they're fit for Passover offerings, they may be used for such purpose, providing Passover is not more than 30 days off. Now that doesn't instantly apply to Jesus, because we're going to see, I think he's a little bit later than that. But it's just drawing out this whole thing that actually the offerings are being drawn from shepherds who have a special dispensation to raise their sheep on the hills and the grass fields and the pastures immediately outside Jerusalem. Normally they have to go further afield, and that special dispensation runs out to the tower, which we know is the tower just beyond Bethlehem, which therefore is likely to be the tower that the shepherds that we know about are sitting at. Another little interesting thought on this is that therefore the shepherds are possibly Levites, because actually the Levites had, if you like, first call on jobs that served the temple. So when the Levitical priesthood was instigated, obviously the sons of Aaron were key to the priesthood. And fascinatingly, it's one of those just really interesting things. I think I touched on this last time, wasn't it? That you can actually follow a genetic marker, because there's no community in all of the world. So if you're a Jew with the name Cohen, or one of the priestly names, which means you are descended of that line, you can actually show the genetic markers all go back to a common ancestor, about somewhere in the second millennia BC, which is, of course, ties in with Scripture, and it's kind of pretty much unbroken. It's quite remarkable, and you can actually, scientists actually use it who don't believe the Bible at all, but they use it for tracing markers of people, because very often in the various diaspora, the Kohen, the priests, kind of still maintained the thing which said, because they were not priests. If you're a priestly family, you're not even allowed to marry outside of the tribe of Levi. If you were a Levite, you could marry someone from another tribe as long as they're an Israelite. But if you were a priest, you had to marry another Levite. So it keeps the genetic code really tight. Does that make sense? So anyway, but in that context, the Levites are a much more mixed bunch. They did marry outside, but the priests didn't. So the priests would only marry Levites, but Levites would marry sometimes outside. But they had, if you like, they were gifted by God the responsibility of service of the temple. So they didn't administer the sacrifices or any of those sorts of things, but they would sweep up after the meeting, put the chairs back, and so on. And they received some recompense for it. The temple guard were drawn from the Levites. They were trusted Levites. So similarly, it's very likely if this is a kind of a flock that is specifically for providing sheep for the temple sacrifice, it's difficult not to imagine that the Levites would make first claim on being the shepherds for it. So it's probable, therefore, then that Jesus was born in Bethlehem on the Jerusalem side of the Migdalida. So in which case he's a fit sacrifice, even if maybe not technically a Passover sacrifice, because he's not the right time of year. But as if you like, as the Lamb of God. And not only has he been born, but of course he's been inspected, which is one of the jobs. So a sacrifice, when it was born, is instantly inspected to see if it's without injury, and it's put aside for sacrifice at that point. So there is a kind of a sense in which, while we're doing a little bit of kind of that speculative putting it together, but we're not doing it with no background, if I can put it that way. It may not be biblical, but actually it is. We're drawing from history, and we're drawing from the rabbinic writings. We're building a picture where what's going on with the shepherds coming, that Luke hasn't told us explicitly because he's writing for a Gentile audience who don't get this, but he knows it and he doesn't want us to lose it. So he's told us about the shepherds sitting there watching their flocks because he understands, but he hasn't spelt it out because they won't get it. Because they're Gentiles and I'm writing for them, they don't see this, but I see it. And they go down, and even the comment of swaddling bands, although of course they get there and Jesus is already wrapped in them, is actually again something that shepherds do. as we actually find that that if a lamb is born that you're going to use, one of the things you may want to do is protect it from injury. So they would swaddle them. And again, we're getting this from the rabbinic writings rather than from scripture. But you can kind of see all these elements are kind of coming together that Luke is aware of, and he's telling, but for a Gentile audience who doesn't get it, so he's not spelt it out. But we can kind of reconstruct it. So where we got on. So going back to Micah, as for you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, seemingly insignificant among the clans of Judah, from you one will emerge who will rule over Israel for me. His goings forth are from long ago, from days of eternity. That's Micah 5:2. So the Aramaic Targum of Johnston translates this, and again, remember the Targums are kind of, if you like, popular expositions of passages in the Bible. It actually translates this as, out of you shall proceed in my presence the Messiah. So it puts the word Messiah into it explicitly. To exercise sovereignty over Israel, whose name has been called from eternity, from the days of everlasting. So you kind of you can kind of see that the key thing really is saying that understanding. So the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem. Going back to the angel. But the angel said to them, "Don't be afraid. Listen carefully, because I'm going to proclaim to you good news that brings great joy to all the people. Today your Saviour is born in the city of David. He's Christ the Messiah, or the Messiah, the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You'll find a baby wrapped in strips of cloth and lying in a manger." And then suddenly a vast heavenly army appeared with the angel, praising God and singing glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among people with whom he is pleased. And there's this kind of wonderful moment. Again, if we put the picture together, because we're so used to seeing it in kind of children's nativities, but actually the initial encounter with the angel, like so many initial encounters, follows a kind of pattern, which is the initial encounter is he's not so glowing. He's just someone who turns up. The word angel just means a messenger, God's messenger. You can imagine, therefore, the shepherds sitting there. They're watching things in the dark. Is there somebody coming? What's that person? And they come up and start talking. And as is often the case, the revelation of the glory kind of comes partway through the message. If I can put it there. In this case, the revelation of the glory is suddenly they're all up in there, and there's a kind of great, presumably kind of glowing experience that is going on for them, which is a quite remarkable thing, because that doesn't happen that often. If I ask you to think about when does a whole host of angels turn up in Scripture, there's a couple of places, but they're not. Remember, Elisha looks out with and says, "Open his eyes," and you'll see that there's more with us, and so he has a kind of. But they're not specifically talking. It's more that he's had his eyes opened and he can see them. But other than that, I can't think of any other. Can anyone think of a time when a group of angels turn up? So these shepherds are having quite the experience, quite the thing to be telling their kids in the years to come. The vast heavenly army appeared with the angel, praising God, singing glory to God in the highest, and earth peace among people. Go on, Sharon.
Curious, because you see all of these postcards and things with the angels in the sky.
Yeah.
I mean, the Bible doesn't say it.
Doesn't say it, no.
But it would seem to me that it would be just as incredible to have one appear on land.
Oh yeah, on the ground.
And then all of a sudden, a whole army of them on
yeah,
land.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a really good thing you raise there, Sharon, because I think, particularly when we're dealing with the angelic and the supernatural, is actually there are such a wide number of ways in which we can imagine it, because the nature of the supernatural is it's something I'm not used to seeing, and I have to explain it to someone who didn't see it. I have to use words that kind of equate but aren't exactly it. Does that make sense? So when I think about this, I'm quite happy, because I don't want anyone to fall out with me, to kind of go with the traditional Christmas card image. But in my head, sometimes I wonder if is it just that they're seeing kind of lights in the sky? Even the words, is it more that they're interpreting this experience of kind of light and whatever, and as the host of angels that have appeared with him? Do you get what I'm saying? Is because actually that's how, if that happened to me, how do I describe it in a way you can get a hold of it? Well, it's the host of angels. It's like an army of angels, and And I haven't kind of gone into great big detailed descriptions of, well, this one was like a glowing light, or this one was 6 foot tall with wings this big, and so on. And we just don't know. So I always, therefore, I with those kind of things, we have to kind of recognise that there's a kind of a cultural element to how we imagine it, if I can put it that way. Because sorry, this is, again, it's a little aside. Some people like the asides, some people find them boring. So I apologize. Actually, no one says they're boring, but some people, it annoys them. But if this is, I'm not now talking on the angelic, but I'm talking about the demonic, but in a similar sort of way. One of the things that's really interesting is that people see the demonic in the way that their culture tells them they should see it. Okay. So psychologists say, oh, well, it's because it's not real, they're just imagining it. I think actually it's the other way around, which is actually the way that the human brain works tends to fit things that we have into the patterns we understand. So even phenomena, strange phenomena, like, when I pull out of my driveway but I don't see the bike, that is because actually your brain doesn't actually see things exactly. It sees things according to what it remembers and it knows that they should look like. Does that make sense? Your brain is being efficient, so you kind of look up the road and you see, and instead of actually seeing the road, what you're actually seeing is your memory of the road. It's a composite memory of your road, and you don't see the bike. The only reason you'd see something is because it was really big, and then your brain goes, whoa, there's something there. Now I stop and I analyze and I genuinely look at things. So therefore I suspect that the reason why you genuinely, if you've in talking to folks who minister a lot in these areas, people often imagine the demonic in the demonic clothing of their culture, is partly because something in their spirit knows they're encountering something, and therefore they see it in terms that make sense to them. Does that make sense? And so there is, and interestingly, it's a phenomena that is now being talked about from a theological point of view. It's kind of beginning to be kind of debated and so on. So I don't want to kind of sound like I'm being kind of cynical or clever or whatever. I'm just saying, if I've grown up in a particular culture and we've talked about angels in these ways, I might imagine them in one way, but somebody else might see it totally different, and they can get very uptight and argumentative. And probably the truth is, they probably experienced something that made total sense of how they described, but they were culturally very different from me. So my assumptions about what they're describing might be different. So I'm just saying it's always a tricky thing when we deal with the supernatural. I think it's very human that we like to imagine that our way of imagining the world is exactly right. I think about, for instance, sorry, it's a slight aside, but it's not unhelpful if you think about these things. If you take the story of Exodus, which I'm going to be writing next when I do the next book, because I'm playing out in my mind how you do things. So I don't want to upset people unnecessarily, but I want to see things also that I think are exciting. And there's a huge chunk of the supernatural elements that, quite remarkably, because we've only discovered things in the last few years, you can actually put natural phenomena to. Now, that doesn't mean God's not in them, because actually, if you take, for instance, the plague of gnats or whatever, they are real gnats. They're not kind of imaginary supernatural gnats, if you like, but God is still in them. Does that make sense? And so, for instance, the burning bush. Actually, if we just move the location of where we think Moses encountered it by a small area, we know that in exactly the right period there were gas fires coming up from the ground. So in the right period, and there is a type of bush that acts like a wick, so it doesn't burn out. So do you get what I'm driving at? So Moses is walking along and he sees a bush and it's not burning. It's burning, but it doesn't, because it acts like a wick, you see. And so he goes over and God speaks to him out of the bush. So is that natural or is it supernatural? Actually, I wouldn't want to divide the two. Because actually, when Moses turns up in front of Pharaoh, he throws his stick on the ground, it turns into a snake. Well, that's not a natural phenomenon. So I'm not denying the supernatural. But what's interesting is that actually it changes slightly our understanding of the Exodus because of the route. And actually, in changing the route, suddenly it becomes more historical, if I can put it that way, because there are things that you can mark out. So it talks about Moses takes a 9 he journeys for 9 nights. And they're actually, if he's going to that place rather than where we tend to think of him going straight north, actually there are 9 oases which actually in the ancient world had facilities for people who were travelling. It doesn't say he travelled for 9 days. What it means is he stopped 9 times, and there were 9 oases on that route. Does that make sense? So suddenly it's becoming more historical. So I quite like the fact that it's becoming more historical. I'm not denying, the Lord, like we said, he's omnipotent. He's got all power. So, if he wants to manifest, and have Pharaoh's riders ride into a huge, gigantic, strawberry jelly, he can do that. but actually, equally, often he speaks through the storm, or he speaks through the phenomena that catches my eye, and that's part of actually the revelation, is that he is a God who's not contained within those things, but is able to use them to shape history according to his desires. So it's not, in my mind, but I'm just kind of conscious, it's not denying the supernatural. It's kind of just stretching the our understanding a little bit, if I can put it that way. And that's a very long digression that really was just simply to say I can't be certain of how they encountered the angels. I just read that they did. Does that make sense? And that is very real, and they respond, and they go and they do something as a result, and their heads are kind of fried by what they've just gone through, and they don't know how to describe it, and they go. So they hurried off, and they located Mary and Joseph and found the baby lying in the manger. So they presumably, it's Bethlehem is not a big town. They can go down. So does anyone know where there's a baby been born? Has anyone heard anything? And eventually someone's going to say there was that pregnant couple. We think they're staying over there, and they track them down and they find them, and there is the baby. And in if you like, in a symbolic way, they fulfill that role of Levitical shepherds who are raising a flock for sacrifice in the temple, and who check the lambs as they're born to see if they're without blemish, and they see the child there in all of his perfection, already bound in swaddling bands, already swaddled for protection, so that no limbs can get broken, and so on, which is part of the process and practice. And when they saw it, they related what they had been told about this child, and all who heard it were astonished at what the shepherd said. You see that little phrase, if we take the view that nobody believed what shepherd said, they weren't allowed in court, which is often what's presented, so to say, comes from a much later period of history than this. Why would they believe them? That's exactly the kind of story that, do you know what, I think you took some flagons of wine up there onto the old tower when you were watching your flocks, and that's what that's where the experience came from. But they didn't. They believed him. They believed them. So that's a good place to take a break, because we've still got to get through Jesus going to the temple and so on. And what time is it? I'm just having a look. 20:39. So yes, we're only a few minutes after when we're probably a good point to stop. I'm going to stop recording for now.